A handful of problems.
Do you hear yourself? Only a handful of apartment complexes in America were taken over by Venezuelan gangs.
Would Donald Trump go after his political opponents?
He was president for 4 years, and he didn't go after his political opponents. You know who did go after her political opponents? Kamala Harris.
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. In this video, we're going to be reviewing JD Vance's recent debate with Karen from ABC, which was a clinical dismantling. Now, I have seen a lot of left-wing channels come out and say how JD Vance got absolutely destroyed, how this was a terrible interview for Vance, which is absolutely hilarious and just goes to show how desperate they are. I mean, Vance is absolutely crushing with these debates, and I mean killing it. I was upset that Vivek didn't get the job, but I can rest assured that he is definitely the next best thing when it comes to absolutely violating these talking heads. So we're going to be focusing on the subject matter of the debate, but also Vance's use of rhetoric and messaging. So let's get into it.
But I want to start with the hurricane. During Hurricane Helene, as we heard, former President Trump suggested the federal government was not only sending FEMA aid meant for the hurricane to migrants, but going out of their way to not help people in Republican areas. Do you think that is true?
Well, Martha, what the president said is that fundamentally FEMA aid is distracted by going to illegal migrants. And by the way, good morning, and thanks for having me. We've got Republican congressmen who are on the ground who represent that area saying that they have to call the White House to get food and water to FEMA. I don't frankly think there's anything malicious going on here, Martha, but I do think that we've had an incompetent response to this particular crisis, particularly in Western North Carolina, which, to be fair, was hit harder than a lot of us expected it. But fundamentally, if you've got 6 days after the hurricane, the 82nd Airborne is still trickling in, I do think that we had a fundamentally incompetent, overly bureaucratic response to the hurricane. So what you hear from folks on the ground is they feel left behind. And Martha, we have to remember, of course, I know this area well. This is the Appalachian region of our country where people have felt ignored by their government for 30 years, and it doesn't help when you have a response to the hurricane that's slow, that's halting, and then you layer on top of it, of course,
Senator Vance
has done a lot.
Senator Vance, I want to go back to
resettlement work. Go ahead.
I want to go back to what former President Trump said. He said they're going out of their way to not help people in Republican areas. There is no truth to that. And on staging, Pentagon officials say that active duty troops were staged and ready to go before being called upon and were instantly out the door. So President Trump, former President Trump, is saying things that aren't true about that money being withheld from Republican areas.
Well, Martha, I think you're actually confusing staging of resources from the rapid response of the U.S. military. I mean, look, in FEMA's defense, there are things after this hurricane that FEMA simply could not do. You actually need military command and control. You need military resources deployed to the area. And I think all the president has said is, frankly, what some of Kamala Harris's surrogates have said, which is that if these areas were a little bit more democratic, maybe Kamala Harris would have focused on them more. That acknowledgement is not to attack, frankly, the good folks of FEMA. It's to suggest that Americans are feeling left behind by their government, which they are, Martha.
Okay,
if you talk to folks on the ground, I've had friends that have been in Boone, North Carolina, helping with the cleanup. It is an extraordinary sense of betrayal and being left behind. People are worried that their government doesn't care about them. I'm much more worried about the incompetence of Kamala Harris's administration that led to that more than I am the fact that Donald
Senator
Trump
Vance, I'm just going to say that local officials and FEMA officials say that is just flat wrong. But I want to, we played some other comments about migrants, including in Aurora, in Colorado, where Trump said the city had been invaded and conquered by Venezuelan gangs. The Republican mayor of the city said flatly the city and state have not been taken over or invaded or occupied by migrant gangs. So do you support Donald Trump making those claims that the Republican mayor says were grossly exaggerated and have hurt the city's identity and sense of safety? I understand what you're saying, that some people left behind, but he's making these statements that the mayor is flat out disputing.
Quick interruption, guys. If you don't mind smashing that like button, it would help me out enormously. And if you are not subscribed to the channel, you are welcome to do so. Let's get back to it.
Well, Martha, you just said the mayor said they were exaggerated.
Grossly
That
exaggerated.
means there's got to be some element of truth here. And of course, President Trump was actually in Aurora, Colorado, talking to people on the ground. And what we're hearing, of course, Martha, is that people are terrified by what has happened with some of these Venezuelan gangs.
Senator Vance, I'm going to stop you because I know exactly what happened.
Martha.
I'm going to stop you. The incidents were limited to a handful of apartment complexes, and the mayor said our dedicated police officers have acted on those concerns. A handful of problems.
Only, Martha, do you hear yourself? Only a handful of apartment complexes in America were taken over by Venezuelan gangs, and Donald Trump is the problem and not Kamala Harris's open border. Americans are so fed up with what's going on, and they have every right to be. And I really find this exchange, Martha, sort of interesting because you seem to be more focused with nitpicking everything that Donald Trump has said rather than acknowledging that apartment complexes in the United States of America are being taken over by violent gangs. I worry so much more about that problem than anything else here. We've got to get American communities in a safe space again. And unfortunately, when you let people in by the millions, most of whom are unvetted, most of whom you don't know who they really are, you're going to have problems like this. Kamala Harris, 94 executive orders that undid Donald Trump's successful border policies. We knew this stuff would happen. They bragged about opening the border, and now we have the consequences, and we're living with it. We can do so much better, but frankly, we're not going to do better, Martha, unless Donald Trump calls this stuff out. I'm glad that he did.
Okay, let's just end that with they did not invade or take over the city, as Donald Trump said. I want to move on to
just a few
women.
Apartment complexes, no big deal.
So if this exchange isn't a perfect example of the larger problem that Vance is alluding to here, then I don't know what is. He's just so right when he says that all they care about is nitpicking what Donald Trump says and not the actual issues.
Trump said the city had been invaded and conquered.
When you have armed Venezuelan gangs, most of whom are probably illegal, taking over entire apartment blocks at gunpoint, you have a big problem, and it's not that Donald Trump is mean. Let's have a look at some of the events that they're talking about.
There have been rumblings of new gang activity in Aurora all summer. Officials have skated around the topic, but now there's video and victims they can't deny.
It's really like being held hostage.
Cindy was a prisoner in her own home. She's lived in this building at 12th and Dallas for years. This summer, when crime got worse, Cindy got cameras. Doorbell video shows a group of armed men forcing their way into her neighbor's home. Another night, her camera outside captured two men approaching a vehicle, guns drawn. She's called 911 so often, they know her by name.
He said, ever considered leaving? If I could afford to leave, I wouldn't be there.
She says neighbors fall asleep to gunfire. Her car still damaged from an overnight shootout.
This is a bullet hole.
It was one of the few times Aurora police responded.
Here's what we're learning from ICE. So take a look at your screen. This is Naudi Lopez Fernandez. He's 21 years old, and he is a citizen of Venezuela. ICE confirms that he did enter the U.S. illegally last year, and since then has been arrested for criminal behavior 4 times in Colorado and in Kansas. He was encountered by U.S. Border Patrol last year near Eagle Pass, was arrested, and then later released. He is in ICE custody tonight. And you take a look here. This is Nafred Zerpa Acosta. He's 20 years old and is also a citizen of Venezuela. He's been in the U.S. at least 2 years now and was encountered by Border Patrol in Texas back in 2022, arrested, and then later released. He was facing local charges in Larimer and Douglas counties, with an immigration judge ordering Zerpa to be removed back in May, and then he was placed under supervision. Now, unlike those other 2 suspects we just went over who do have criminal histories and have been arrested, ICE does not have any information on this man, Anderson Zambrano Pacheco. However, he is still one of the suspects identified in that viral video. All 3 of these men are facing felony charges tonight.
So these individuals came over the border illegally, have been in police custody for criminal activity multiple times illegally, yet they are still allowed to roam free and go and terrorize communities in Colorado and take over apartment buildings at gunpoint. I mean, if there's somebody who can untangle the logic here for me and let me know in the comments in what universe this is possible in, or how this is possibly just for the American people, then I'd really love to know.
On behalf of the 16,000 men and women represented by the National Border Patrol Council, we strongly support and endorse Donald J. Trump for President of the United States.
How could there be such an alarming disregard for law and order, where people are allowed to come into your country and do this?
Mi gente, he pensado invadir una casa en United States, ya que me enteré que existe una ley que dice que si una casa no está habitada, podemos expropiarla.
I mean, if some criminal snuck into your house through the back door, would you kick him out? How about if they sat on your couch and started eating your food? What about if they assaulted one of your family members and then commandeered the master bedroom at gunpoint? Do you think that at every single step along the way there, it would be reasonable to kick that person out back to wherever the hell they came from? Well, I mean, not under Kamala Harris, that won't happen.
Dallas police charged 4 illegals with robbing a woman at gunpoint during a home invasion. San Antonio police arrested 20 people on drugs and human trafficking charges at an apartment complex. And some are confirmed members of the brutal gang, the Venezuelan gang, Tren Aragua.
And so on to the next bit now about abortion, which I actually think for JD Vance, he's taken a very intelligent position here in terms of his messaging, because as unfortunate as this is and as abhorrent as this is, the issue of abortion could well decide this coming election.
A few apartment complexes that the mayor did not seem was invading the entire city. Let's move on to women and abortion. Donald Trump is leading Kamala Harris in our poll among males by 8 points, but lagging behind Harris by 9 points among females. You said during the debate that you and Trump have more to do to earn back people's trust, specifically as it relates to women and reproductive rights. 56% of those polled support restoring abortion access to what it was under Roe v. Wade. So what would you say specifically to the women watching this morning who believe they should have their own say over their bodies and not the government, either state or federal?
Well, Martha, first of all, what I'd say is that I think renationalizing this entire debate is a big mistake. And I understand that a lot of Americans, according to that poll, apparently disagree with me and President Trump here. But we want to respect Californians. We want to respect Alabamans. We want to respect Pennsylvanians. These folks are going to have different approaches to this particular topic. And I think that what we had in this country for 50 years was a culture war over this particular issue because we had nationalized it. And it's also important, Martha, that while Kamala Harris uses the slogan of returning to Roe versus Wade, she has endorsed policies that go way beyond anything that Roe versus Wade ever meant in this country. Taxpayer-funded abortions for late-term abortions. She's explicitly refused to endorse things like the Born Alive Act, which would protect babies who survive botched abortions. So while she hides behind the popular slogan of Roe versus Wade, Kamala Harris's actual abortion views, I think, are much more radical than even a lot, I think, frankly, most of our pro-choice citizens.
Let me go back again. What would you say to those women who don't want people involved in their individual rights? Kamala Harris is on that side of that, not you.
Well, I think, Martha, that's not right, actually. I think Kamala Harris has taken this so far that a lot of women, if they knew Kamala Harris's actual view and not the slogan, they would recognize that it's far more radical. They can believe in individual autonomy, but also recognize there are, of course, limits here. We don't want to abort 9-month-old babies here, and we don't want to have taxpayers funding it. So I think everybody recognizes there's a right balance to strike. But to answer your question, Martha, what I would say to women is that Donald Trump and I want to make it easier to make the choice of life in the first place. And I know a lot of young women, especially when I was younger, who chose abortion because they feel like they didn't have any options. And what I want to do as a person who admittedly, Martha, wants to protect the most vulnerable members of our society, I'd like to make it easier for women to choose life to begin with. I think that goes to lowering the cost of housing, which of course has skyrocketed under Kamala Harris's administration. I think it's making it easier for working moms to balance work and life and family. There's a lot that we can do to become more pro-family. That's how I think we can best earn back trust. And
Senator,
yes.
I want to get to some other topics here.
Okay, so strategically, I think Vance takes the right approach here because let's just face it, the Trump administration in this election cycle really has its back up against the wall when it comes to abortion. On the left, there are an alarming amount of people who are single-issue voters on this matter. And this became abundantly clear to me when I went around LA and was interviewing the libs about who they're voting for and why. What do you think are the most important issues with the upcoming election?
Women's reproductive rights.
For me, number one is abortion.
Yep.
Yeah.
Reproductive rights, for sure.
Women's rights.
Women's health.
Women's health?
Is number one for me, and the protection of our bodily rights.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd probably say the same.
And actually, furthermore, what we're seeing is also a bunch of people on the right who believe that the Trump administration is way too liberal with abortion. And you do get people who are single-issue voters on the right as well in terms of this particular issue. So with this one, rhetoric and messaging is everything. And I think Vance and his team have refined this to a point where they've got a pretty good strategy. And the messaging that they're going with is empowering women to choose life. This would obviously resonate with people who are pro-life and also would soften the blow of the emotional response that women have when they hear Republicans talking about abortion. They're empowering women, girl power. But I do wonder what that means in practice, however, because in order to do this, you'd obviously have to improve the cost of living, but also you have a big fight on your hands when it comes to pushing back against the feminist propaganda that loves abortion and loves death and actually fundamentally hates life. There would need to be a great focus on venerating motherhood and pedestalizing it for the great virtue that it is, rather than treating it like some sort of dead end that you do if nothing else works out. So I like the rhetoric, but I would love to see this played out. I mean, let me know in the comments, what would be wrong with seeing some sort of mass government-funded campaign to venerate motherhood? I mean, the feminists and the left, for that matter, are extremely active when it comes to pushing their propaganda. So why don't we just take the fight to them?
I would much rather regret not having children than regret having children later in life.
A book that seriously shifted my perspective on this is called Regretting Motherhood.
Babies are born sick and they have ailments. Partners can't handle it and they bail. And then it's a great disappointment that the child grows up to be something totally different than the idea that you have in your head. And once the resentment sets in, they tend to lash out at people who chose not to have children. Mostly out of jealousy because they have the freedom to do things while you still have a child attached to your hip.
I mean, there are a lot of people on the culture war front who are doing great work in this regard, but maybe we could step it up. Let me know what you guys think. Let's review the rest.
Here, on the Attorney General, sure. You said on Friday that the most important person in government in a Trump-Vance administration, other than the president, is not you. It would be the Attorney General. Why do you consider that the most important spot, the second most important spot?
Well, one reason, Martha, is just public opinion. And what I mean here is that we really want the American people to believe that we have a fair and equitable administration of justice. If not, the entire sort of system falls apart. You need people to believe that if the Attorney General prosecutes somebody, it's motivated by justice and law and not by politics. And unfortunately,
would Donald Trump go after his political opponents? Would Donald Trump go after his political opponents? He suggested that in the past.
Martha, he was president for 4 years, and he didn't go after his political opponents. You know who did go after her political opponents? Kamala Harris, who has tried to arrest everything from pro-life activists to her political opponents.
He said those people who cheated will be prosecuted
as a weapon against people. Well, he said that people who violated our election laws will be prosecuted. I think that's the administration of law. He didn't say people are going to go to jail because they disagree with me. That has, in fact, been the administration and the policy of Kamala Harris, Martha. Look, under the last 3.5 years, we have seen politically motivated after politically motivated prosecution. I'd like us to just get back to a system of law and order where we try to arrest people when they break the law, not because they disagree with the prevailing opinion of the day. And there's a fundamental difference here between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Donald Trump may agree or disagree on a particular issue, but he will fight for your right to speak your mind without the government trying to silence you. Kamala Harris is explicitly
Senator Vance,
censorship.
I want to go back to Donald Trump.
We've got to get a Department of Justice that believes in the First Amendment, Martha. The First Amendment is the bedrock of our Constitution.
Senator,
we have Kamala Harris who doesn't
Senator, we're just about out of time here. We're just about out of time here. And I want to end with this. In interview after interview, question after question, and in the debate, you refused to say that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. So I'm just going to assume that if I ask you 50 times whether he lost the election, you would not acknowledge that he did. Is that correct?
Martha, you asked this question. I've been asked this question 10 times in the past couple of weeks. Of course, Donald Trump and I believe there were problems in 2020. You haven't asked about inflation.
No, I'm sorry. Let's stick to this.
The American people want us to talk about how to make their lives better. They don't want us to.
Why won't you say that?
Because, Martha, I believe that in 2020, when big tech firms were censoring American citizens, that created very serious problems. And by the way, Martha, you're a journalist. You represent the American media. Look at the polling on this. A lot of Americans feel like they were silenced in the run-up to the 2020 election. That is such a bigger issue. That fundamental problem than me and Donald Trump talking about it. And unfortunately,
Martha, I don't understand why you won't just say it if you believe it.
Won't just say what? That I think the 2020 election had some problems? I've said that repeatedly.
Did Donald Trump lose? That's the question, and you know that's the question.
Martha, I've said repeatedly, I think the 2020 election had problems. You want to say rigged? You want to say he won? Use whatever vocabulary term you want. I want to focus on the fact that we had big technology firms censoring our fellow citizens in a way that violated our fundamental rights. The fact that you're so obsessed with what word I used to describe this phenomenon rather than the phenomenon itself suggests something very broken in the American media. If we want to restore trust in American elections and democracy, which I want to do, Martha, we have to talk openly about what happened in 2020. And most importantly, we've got to talk about what happened afterwards. Okay. Americans being unable to afford the basic necessities of middle-class life because Kamala Harris is in the White House.
We're going to leave it right there. Appreciate your time this morning.
So just an absolute demolition there. You can ask about the 2020 election until you go blue in the face. It's not going to sway anyone. It's old and people are looking forward. So guys, hope you did enjoy that one. If you want to chuck the thumbs up on the video, that would be greatly appreciated. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you'd like to watch another one, right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.